I'm Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies. It's great to have you here this morning. Indeed, we've been especially keen to see education reform as part of our mission. We need a high-quality education system to achieve economic prosperity for the next generation. That's been our motto for the last 50 years. Now, this morning, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the New South Wales Education Minister, Sarah Mitchell. She's also the Minister for Early Childhood Learning. Sarah has been a Nationals member of the New South Wales Legislative Council since March 2011. Meanwhile, please welcome the Education Minister, Sarah Mitchell.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, and good morning, everybody. I'm double mic'd. I feel a bit like I was going to say Beyonce, but maybe Taylor Swift might be more appropriate. My 9-year-old will think that that's great. But thank you, as I said, Tom, for the warm welcome, and to Glenn and to everybody at the CIS for asking me to come and speak to you all this morning. So I thought this morning I would outline a few things that I guess I've been focused on during my time as Education Minister and give a bit of insight, I suppose, into the reasons why this is the policy direction that I'm choosing to take as a minister and of course supported by government, and then talk a little bit about issues around teacher supply, because I think that's obviously a key area of focus at the moment for us, and sharing some of the thinking and some of the initiatives that we have underway might, I hope, be of interest to you all. One of the things that I find quite interesting as the Education Minister, for a sector which I think generally is seen as being made up of a lot of progressive people, it can be inherently very conservative. And for me, I think that's been an interesting observation during my time in the portfolio, because I think change is often considered with scepticism, and it carries a real ability to divide rather than unite. And I think that is the case with academics and with educators. And it's been interesting, particularly during COVID, watching how flexible our education system can be when it needs to be, but also that there is almost that inherent resistance to change. And I do think that that's been built up over a long period of time. For me, there's two clear principles that I think about when I'm creating policy and working with my team in my office or within the department about what we want to do. The first is it has to be in line with the evidence base. There is so much research at the moment that shows what works in education, where we can improve. Having evidence-based policy is always the right thing to do, and that's sort of fundamental position number one. And then the second part, which should be a no-brainer, is that it has a positive change for students in the classroom. Because if we're not thinking about what we're doing for our kids with what we do in education policy, we're not doing our job. And I think some of the challenges that I've seen in education reform over the last little while probably stem maybe from not adhering to those two core principles. And I would say, as much as there's amazing people that work day in and day out in the Department of Education in New South Wales, it's a pretty big ship. There's a lot of people working there, and I think there's often really great intentions, but that turn into a cascade of policies and ideas and things that would land on a teacher's desk that sort of makes them think, where has this come from? Does this help me in my practice? Does this help my students? And so for me, it's been about really trying to pare back, whether it's coming from the department, from NESA, from a head teacher, from a principal in a school, and really go back to focusing on, is it a sound evidence policy base? Is it good for students? And I think you'll see when I address some of the things that we've done in the last little while, that theme should hopefully be fairly apparent, because I worry that if we build too much scepticism within the profession towards the change that we want to bring in, we're never going to get the outcomes that we need. And for me, I think it's about being on that journey of trying to streamline what we do in our schools, make sure that we support our staff, make sure we free up time for teachers to do what they do best, treat them as the professionals that they are. And I think that there's a lot of really exciting things happening, and we've got to get that message out there that, it is a really great profession to be teaching or to be working in education. There are so many great things that you can do day in, day out. It's incredibly rewarding. That's what I see every day, every week when I visit schools. And so part of it is about making sure that we get that message out there as well, and not just some of the negativity that we seem to see quite frequently at the moment. So there's a few things that I wanted to touch on just in terms of, I guess, policy initiatives and reforms. The first is the introduction of what we call the School Success Model, or the SSM, and we brought that in to effectively replace local schools, local decisions, which came in when our government was not long elected under Adrian Piccoli. And One of the things that I think is interesting for me in this role is obviously we've been in government for nearly 12 years. Policy needs to adapt and change in that time. And I think if you're looking at different iterations of things as a government, that's not a bad thing. That actually shows that you're willing to make the decisions and make sure that policies aren't set and forget, but rather they have the ability to be iterative, to be improved as they go along. And that's definitely what we've done with local schools, local decisions being replaced by the school success model. Because I think the concept of local schools, local decisions was a good one. I think the idea around giving more principal autonomy, around recognising that it's not one size fits all, I think that was a good concept. But I don't think we foreshadowed the amount of money that would be coming into our schools through the Gonski funding agreements, how principals would feel quite overwhelmed by those decisions that they needed to make. We've had underspends in many school bank accounts because I think principals, who tell me that they worry about, well, is the money going to be there this year or the next, how they manage that. And so what we've been able to do with the new introduction of school success model is work with every school to set a target across a range of metrics. And it's not just looking at academic results like NAPLAN and HSE, although that is, of course, part of it, but we're also looking at things like wellbeing. We're looking at things like attendance. We're looking at an equity cohort, so making sure that children in those schools who come from different backgrounds are also achieving growth and improvement. And I think what is great about that is that it gives us really clear data sets, really clear evidence base in terms of what's working well in particular schools and what needs improvement. And the way we've set up SSM is that we're not comparing schools, say in Gunnedah where I live, to the eastern suburbs of Sydney, because you've got different socioeconomic considerations. What we've done is group schools together who have similar statistical backgrounds, similar groups and cohorts of students, and that's how we've worked out effectively their targets and what we'd like them to achieve in terms of growth. And I think that's important as well because, like I said, it's using the evidence base. But also what it goes to is student success. So it means that we can see if a particular school's doing a really great job, in attendance or in numeracy or literacy, we can look at what they're doing. We can leave them to it. We get out of the way. We don't need to come in and say to those principals, you need extra support in this space because what they're doing is working. But on the other side, if we do start to see in certain school communities that they're maybe not hitting where we would like them to be in terms of their funding and support, we bring in targeted support from the department and say, you're not really meeting where we'd like you to be, say, on attendance. Have you thought about running these programs? X school, which is similar to you, is doing this and it's working really well. And so we can share and collaborate across school communities in a way that we haven't before. And I think that to me is a real key in terms of making sure that the incredible amount of funding that's going into our schools at the moment will end up giving us better outcomes for our students, which actually has to be the end goal here. I also want to briefly talk about Phonics, which is something that I think the last time I was here we were chatting about because I love it. I think I declared in one of the SMH, and I know a few of the SMH team are here, that the reading wars were over, and I got differing views and some nice friends on social media when I made those comments. That's part of the job, but I very firmly believe that phonics is the best way to teach children how to read, and the evidence shows that overwhelmingly. And what we see since we've introduced a phonics check in New South Wales public schools, we had a pilot in 2020. In 2021, we had more than 66,000 Year 1 students across 1,600 schools complete that screening check, and the result showed us that 57% of those Year 1 students were meeting or exceeding the expected target, which seems a bit low. We don't want to get that higher, but it's up from 43% when we did the check. So literally in a 12-month period of putting that focus on phonics, we had an increase of 14% of students being able to understand those core basics. And interestingly, when we looked at the percentage of Aboriginal students who either met or exceeded that expected achievement score, when we did the trial, it was 18.4%. When we've brought it in statewide, it's jumped to 29%. So again, the evidence is showing that having that phonics approach works, and it's a huge improvement. And that's why we've brought it in, and that's why we're sticking to it, because we know the difference that it makes. While I'm talking about the early years and why it's important, obviously, to get things like phonics and those core sort of basic proficiencies done early on. Obviously, you would have seen our many announcements in the budget in relation to early childhood education, and I've been the Minister for Early Learning for 5 years, and I genuinely believe that some of the best things that I can do as Education Minister is actually to focus on those early years because, again, in a room like this, I don't need to tell you all the various stats and research, but 90% of brain development is done by the time a child is 5. By the time they walk in the door on that first day of kindergarten, we can already predict fairly accurately the likelihood of success or where they'll be when they finish Year 12. And that's not unique to Australia or New South Wales. That's world-leading evidence that shows that. So why we want to bring in a universal pre-K year, it's something that I have worked on for a number of years. I saw it in action in Canada. I saw the difference it made in terms of social and emotional and wellbeing skills for those children, the ability to walk in on the first day, ready to go, ready to learn, a great transition program, picking up any behavioural, social, developmental issues. And again, as part of our universal pre-K year, we want a full suite of development checks that we're doing in partnership with health. It will change the lives of children in our state. There is no doubt about that. And it's a significant investment by our government. And there's a long lead time in terms of the time frame. We want it in 5 days a week free for every child by 2030 because we've got work to do. We need to train the workforce up so that we can have these programs ready to go. We need to work with our early childhood sector. Yes, we want to see more preschools on school sites, and that's across all 3 school systems. But we also want to support our existing early childhood services as well. We've got fantastic community preschools, not-for-profit, business-run long daycare centres that do incredible work that are embedded and trusted in their community. We want to support them as well because we know that we need the capacity to effectively put 100,000 children in New South Wales every year through a universal pre-K. We can't do it as government alone. We've got to do it in conjunction with the services and with the sector. And I think it's really exciting reform and something that I know will make a massive difference. The evidence shows that it works and it puts students at the centre. So again, it sort of comes back to those core policy areas. Nationally, I think there's other work that obviously we're focusing on in terms of teacher supply, and I might move into that topic now. I think that for me, obviously, these aren't issues unique to New South Wales when we look at our workforce pipeline coming through. And indeed, they're not issues that are just unique to education. We see pressures in health. We see pressures at the moment in hospitality and business. You know, I can't tell you in my small country town of Gunnedah, very often there'll be a sign on the door that a business is shut for a few days because of COVID, because of staffing issues. We're all dealing with similar challenges. And I know when I speak to state and territory colleagues that we're all dealing with similar pressures. So to have a national conversation about, well, what does this look like? A few things that we've put on the agenda obviously include things like our overseas recruitment and opportunities to look at teachers in other jurisdictions who are similar to us here in Australia and still have that high standard of accreditation, but see who wants to come and live here. It's a beautiful country. There's a lot of expats who I hope would like to come back as well. So these are the issues that we're working through, but also working with the universities and teacher training and what that looks like. And I think that there's some real opportunities for reform there. So looking forward to Education Minister's meeting in a couple of weeks' time, the first time in person for a long time, thanks to COVID, and really nutting out some of these issues at a national level as well so that all states and territories can benefit. I think when it comes to the general issues around teacher supply, the reality is that we're dealing with a mosaic of different challenges. Yes, we've got to look at workload. Yes, we have to look at pay. We've got to look at training. But as I said earlier, we've also got to look at some of the negativity that's out there at the moment in terms of the teaching profession, because what I worry is that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're a prospective teacher and all you see in the media is how horrible it is to be a teacher, then that's going to be a real challenge for us to try to get people into the profession. And we've got an advertising campaign coming up soon, which is only one part of what we're doing. But like I said, there's such a disconnect sometimes between what is portrayed and what I see day in, day out when I visit schools. And I think we need to get better at messaging the fact that teaching is a really good generalist degree, that it's a really great opportunity to come in every day and shape the lives of young people in your classroom. It's pretty amazing. There's not many jobs where you get the opportunity to do that. And we also have to look differently at how we supply our teachers. I think the old way of looking at things has gone. And when you look at the rates around the ITE completions, the dropout rate in New South Wales, I think the latest stats I saw from 2019 showed about a 30% figure of people pulling out midway through. We need to look at why. We need to look at what is it we're doing in our teaching courses with our universities to make that happen. I think we need to look at how we approach those ITE courses depending on the age of the student, their experience. And I noticed the front page of the Oz today, talking about that mid-career opportunity that the federal government are keen to look at. Well, we've got our first cohort of those people in our schools at the moment. We did this about a year ago, and again, there was criticism about it at the time, but we've got our first 30 odd, and these are people who have been engineers, these are people who have been agronomists, these are people who have been university lecturers, who we're supporting financially and with mentorships through their 2 2-year masters, 6 months in, they're already in our school communities. And there's other programs that have worked in this space successfully for a long time over the last little while too. So this is about looking at things a bit differently and not being afraid to make those changes. Because I also think we've got to remember that teaching's a profession. It's not a life sentence. We don't have to get people in forever. And if I was to say to people in the room here, put your hand up if you have the same job that you've had since you left university. I'm not going to do it, but because you might prove me wrong. But most people change their careers. That's the world that we live in 2022. You come in, you come out, you try different things. We should be okay with that being the same for teaching. And I think the old way of you were in and you taught for 30 or 40 years and often at the same school. That's wonderful, but it's not the modern reality of most people entering the workforce these days. And rather than be afraid of that, we should embrace it and look at how we can attract people in mid-career. We need to look better, I think, at the data, and Glenn and I were talking about this earlier, of who leaves after what period of time, but also who comes back, because it's actually a really great family-friendly profession in a lot of ways. There's an ability to go and do other things, to pick up casual work, to stay in the system. I think work that we should do around, the accreditation and what those requirements are to literally stay qualified but still be able to dip in and dip out. I think there's a real opportunity there. We also need, of course, to look at workload. There's been a few announcements we've made in the last couple of days around that particularly. Initially, what we would like to do is bring in effectively more admin assistance for our teachers, sort of PAs for teachers is what I called them. And we'll start with a trial of 200, but I envisage that that's something that we will end up with in every school community in the future. That's what I'd like to see, because we have our student learning support officers and they do an amazing job, obviously, as the name suggests, focusing on students and giving them assistance in the classroom. But you don't need a teaching degree to be able to do data entry at come report time. You don't need a teaching degree to be able to print resources up or laminate all the amazing things that go up on classroom walls. To have somebody who's in the classroom who can be there literally as an extra pair of hands for a teacher so that they can focus on the core skill that they have their degree and that they're trained to do. That's what every other profession does. The doctor isn't seeing you as their patient and then doing the paperwork for you and booking your next appointment. A solicitor doesn't go to court and then come back and write all the letters and answer the phone and go and get the coffee. People do have different roles within these professions, and part of that initiative is actually looking at teachers in the same way. And then just lastly, I'll mention yesterday we touched on, the Premier and I were over at Camaray Public School, where we're doing some more work around resources for teachers, linking it to the curriculum, because the number one thing that teachers say takes the time for them, and they've told us in our own studies, and I know the Grattan Institute did this at a national level as well, is lesson preparation and planning and resources. So what we will be doing, rolling out from term 4 this year, is a complete suite of resources that is linked to the curriculum, that will literally have somebody who might be a year 1 teacher who is teaching maths and a unit on patterns can go on, they can download materials, printable worksheets for the class, assessment tasks to match that, online resources and videos. The whole thing will be there for them. They'll still have the ability to adopt it and create, a way that it suits their school context, but it will literally be a one-stop shop for every year group, every teacher, every KLA area that we've never had before. And the work that Grattan did estimated that would save teachers about 3 hours a week. So these are the things that we are very conscious of trying to improve, because I do think that workload is a part where that's a lever that we can pull. And again, I think that will help in terms of the status of the profession, the way that we hear teachers talking about these issues. The last thing I just want to touch on relates to teacher supply. And obviously at the moment, in terms of vacancies, we have sat at a fairly steady rate when it comes to our teacher vacancies in New South Wales. We're the biggest education system in the Southern Hemisphere. We've got 90,000 teachers on the books. It's the most we've ever had in the public system in New South Wales. There are absolutely vacancies in our system. There will always be vacancies in our system because people move schools, people will change, they'll take positions, they take leave. That is part of what we have to deal with managing such a big public education system in this state. But what interests me more is where I can look at individual schools and see, well, where are there specific gaps? Where are the outliers where actually there's quite a large number of teachers that are out? What are the subject areas where we're seeing those concerns? What are the geographical areas where we're feeling those pressures? And our teacher supply strategy, which we funded and announced last year, is really quite targeted in making sure that we fill those gaps where they need to be. But I also think that there is good work happening in this space. I think that it's exciting that we're working with the federal government, that we're working with the universities that we're working across sectors to deal with these challenges. I feel very, very bright and very hopeful about the future of education in New South Wales. So that's not a bad place to be in as the Minister at this point in time. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Minister. I want to start with the school success model. That's where you opened.
Yep.
Over the weekend, the Australian Primary Principals Association said, quote, "Principals feel confined by a morass of measurement which kills initiative and creativity." Do we have too much measurement and monitoring in schools?
I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is because if you don't measure something, you can't know what you need to do to fix or improve. And so I think Mark Scott used to say when he was the secretary of our department, if you aim for nothing, you'll hit nothing. And I do think that having that kind of modern approach, as I said, that data, evidence-based reform, to actually really understand and track how students are achieving is important. And as I said in my address, what I like about school success model is that it recognises different contexts of school communities. And so I think we try very hard to make sure that the data that we capture is necessary, that we do it in a way that's smart. And part of that is looking at our systems, I guess, behind the scenes in terms of how teachers enter that data, how they share that with the department. I maybe shouldn't say, but we've had pretty antiquated tech systems in New South Wales Department of Education for a long time, and other sectors may feel the same. I was quite surprised by some of that. There's a few smiling faces of people who know what that's been like. So trying really to clean up, I guess, the back end and that data entry point so that teachers don't feel like they're spending their whole time giving us that information. But it's actually really important because it's important so that we know firstly how students are tracking and where we can find support. As a minister, frankly, it's important for me when I go to Treasury and say I'd like more money to do this. It's really helpful to have evidence-based and data to be able to use that. So I understand, concerns about the time that it takes, but I think that's actually about us trying to improve the systems of how we collect it, and so that it's not just seen as data for data's sake, but there is actually a tangible benefit to doing it.
Minister, you went to Phonics next in your comments, and it's something we really welcome has been the commitment that the government's made to around Phonics, but it seems like we're only halfway through that journey. We've got the screening check, which allows us to touch on the assessment piece. We've also got to, I suppose, go further as far as ensuring that the practice that follows that, the intervention that follows that, is committed also to the similar evidence base. How do we go the next step? Because as you noted, the reading wars are not quite over. There's still some resistance. How do we address the practice side too?
Yeah. So I think the key element to that is obviously the work that we've been doing with the curriculum review and embedding phonics in that. So we've started with Cater 2 with maths and English KLAs out, and that's something that all systems and all sectors are using. And I know that there's some friends from our Catholic and potentially from the independent school sectors here as well. So there's a real alignment in terms of this is the position that we are taking, and our curriculum in New South Wales very strongly reflects that. The Australian curriculum also now reflects phonics, which is they're probably not quite as explicit as I would have liked them to be, but we adapt and adopt so we can still make it work for us in New South Wales. So I think that curriculum is important. And then also I guess the next piece is the work that the universities do in terms of their ITE courses and that preparation around teaching phonics. But we are not shifting from that. It is embedded and that is the expectation that is what's taught in our classrooms.
So the curriculum was an area of focus around the entire country, and everybody in education was really embedded in that issue through pretty much all of last year. It really did soak up a lot of educational oxygen. Do you feel that where that's landed is something that you're happy with for New South Wales?
The Australian curriculum?
That's right.
I am, because, as I said, we're a little different than some of the other states in that we still have our own curriculum here in New South Wales. Now, obviously, when you can have as much alignment as possible between the national curriculum and our state-based curriculum, that makes things easier, because I think sometimes teachers might get a bit confused in terms of, well, which am I meant to be doing and how does it work? So for me, the key things were definitely around phonics, but definitely around some of the earlier iterations of that draft curriculum. I think left some core concepts until too late, particularly in some of the maths areas as well. So I think where we landed was a good compromise. I think for us as New South Wales, like I said, most of it we're happy with, but we're going through our own process now where if there are certain parts that we would like to strengthen or things that we think, don't need as much focus, etc., we can do that through our own curriculum process. And in some ways we have the luxury of doing that, given that we have our own curriculum bodies that other states don't have.
And in those early iterations through NESA, there was, you could clearly see an emphasis around improving the state of grammar in particular in that side, but also it appears to me a better recognition of the role of knowledge plays in early mathematics development. Is that something that we should expect to see rolled out through the remaining NESA documents?
Yeah, I think so, because again, it's following that evidence base, and that's what we want to get to. And I think the initial curriculum work that we have done, like I said, K to 2's out, and then I think 3 to 10 maths and English is also out for consultation now as well. There is a very clear structure. There is very much that focus on those early years, and you know, I don't really like the term back to basics, but it tends to be kind of quite popular in the vernacular. But getting things right early and embedded, and making sure that children understand those fundamental concepts and how to then apply that knowledge through other things that they will learn throughout their time is really important. And I also think, to be frank, you know, I've got a almost 9-year-old. It's a birthday on Sunday, and a 4-year-old. As a parent, I think that gives you confidence in the education system if you can see your children progressing and really understanding those core concepts early on. And I think, parents are probably the piece that I didn't speak about in my address, but you've got to take families with you as well, because if they're engaged in their child's learning journey, again, evidence shows much better outcomes for that child as well. So I think that's important in terms of parental expectations with what's taught at our schools as well.
So you touched on K to 2 there, but you also mentioned the preschool commitment as well.
Yeah.
Which is I think, an important one and an important milestone and step for education here in New South Wales and nationally. How can we be confident that additional investment really is going to lead to improvements in school readiness?
So I think there's a few things. I think the investment in the workforce is critical, and making sure that we've got highly qualified professional staff continuing to work in our early childhood services in the state. You know, that budget commitment, when we look at everything from the Childcare Affordability Fund, which we're going to be doing here in New South Wales, through to Universal Pre-K, through to Brighter Beginnings, over the next decade, that's a $15 billion commitment from government. When I first became Early Childhood Minister, my entire budget for a year was $300 million. So it is a significant jump in terms of money. And as part of that, in the next 4 years, we've got almost $300 million just on workforce investment alone. And so I think that should give people an indication of the scale of the amount of money that we're putting into this, and why. You know, we've had just a few weeks ago almost 400 people that we're going to upskill from being diploma qualified into their degree qualification. That will keep happening. We've got to make sure we invest in that workforce. But also, I think, you know, picking up a lot of those early indicators of things that kids may struggle with when they get to school. You know, the developmental checks, about half of kids in New South Wales don't do their 4-year-old development check. And that's where you can pick up things around speech, around vision, around hearing, around behavioural, issues or challenges. We're missing a lot of that. And I'm still surprised, even though there are a lot of people that do send their children to early childhood education now, the stats are up and the numbers are up in terms of participation and enrolment. There are still a lot of children who walk in the door on the first day of kindergarten who the teachers haven't seen. They haven't done a transition. They don't know what's coming in. How we can then better prepare our school system for the cohort of children that are coming in, because we're going to have eyes on them. We're going to know who's there. We're going to know what supports they need. They're going to have that opportunity to have a full year of really being embedded in a learning environment before they start school. And I also think the other part of that, which I haven't spoken too much publicly about, although I have mentioned it in passing, is I actually think it gives us an opportunity in New South Wales to look at the school starting age, because one of the concerns that I hear a lot from kindergarten teachers is you're in a classroom with 4.5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, because obviously you have to be at school the year you turn 6, but a lot of parents will send their children early because they can, and overwhelmingly it's not because, you know, they're so bright and ready to go. It's because it means they don't have to get another year of daycare. It means they don't have the extra cost of early childhood. This will be an opportunity for us, I think, to recalibrate that, in the sense that it might be you start kindergarten the year you turn 6, you do the universal pre-K year the year you turn 5, and that gives us a much better opportunity to really streamline that process, rather than that challenge, which is hard, because if those kids aren't quite ready, it's hard for them to ever catch up. And that's just the honest reality that we're dealing with in some of our kindergarten classrooms.
Would you see the option then for some children, if they weren't quite developmentally ready, to have a second year in? Well,
I think they're the things we need to work through as we embed it. I mean, like I said, my goal would be school the year you turn 6, universal pre-K the year you turn 5, and then still that opportunity for 4 years of early childhood education before that. But again, these are the nuances that we need to work through, and that's why we've got to do it with the early childhood sector and with our schools to make sure that we get that balance right. But, my vision of having every child on the first day of kindergarten has had at least a full year of quality early childhood education 5 days a week, all their developmental checks done, any early intervention and support when it comes to those challenges that children may have, that will start them in such a good position compared to some of the different issues that families are dealing with now. And, as I said in my address, the best indicator of how a child will finish school is how they start school. So it's an important investment for a lot of reasons.
To the teacher workforce. So you've noted that vacancies are up but not significantly up. That the teacher workforce is larger than it's ever been, 91,000 teachers and 37,000 support staff. Attrition is also, people would be surprised to know that attrition is also relatively low as well. That all sounds like good news for the teaching profession.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Why is it that there's always such a negative perception about the state of affairs?
Look, I think there's a couple of things. At the moment, I would say that the COVID impacts are quite significant, and I think the casual pool, because there is so much work and there's a lot of permanent work and a lot of the casual staff have taken up temporary or permanent positions in our schools, that's a challenge at the moment. And the COVID impacts and flu impacts, I would say, in terms of illness in our system over the last couple of years, and I know this is a view shared by the other sectors as well, is really hard. So in New South Wales, the latest stats that I saw just last week is we're up 38% on sick leave this year compared to last year. We're up more than 60% on sick leave compared to pre-COVID times. And so what that means in practice is, I spoke to a teacher on the Central Coast not long ago who said he had 10 staff call in sick that week. They'd been at an event and COVID was popular, and anyway, that's what life happens. And he could get 6 casuals, but he couldn't get 10. And so for that week, everyone else was stretching to cover other people's classes. He said to me in a normal week, he would probably need 2 or 3 casuals. And so the supply demand at the moment, particularly in terms of those casual spots filling vacancies when people are away, I think there are a lot of pressures around that. I think the workforce is tired because of that. People are feeling overworked, pivoting to going to work from home and learning from home and coming back. I mean, our teachers did an amazing job with that, but that's hard and that's significant change as well. So I do think that at the moment there is a sense of fatigue because everyone has felt those impacts of having COVID impact in their school, going from home to back, and the uncertainty of where we are. And I think that that's coming through in some of the frustrations with the workforce. The other thing that I would say, and look, I'm a politician, so bear with me, we have an election in March, okay? So we know that unions tend to prefer governments of a different colour to mine, and we're all adults in the room and smart enough to understand that. I look at us compared to Victoria, where they've actually signed their award at a lower rate that we're offering in terms of pay. They're having similar issues with COVID, similar issues with vacancy. There's no industrial action down there. There's a Labor government down there. So I do think that there is absolutely a political element to what is happening at the moment, and that's fine. That's part of the realities of what we work in. But what I get upset about with that is when it does skew, I guess, the perception. And I'll just give one example, and I won't name the town because I don't want to embarrass the journalist, but I was at a small country town and I'd been at their school, and there's a thing at the moment where, not everywhere, but when a government member walks in, union members walk out. And someone said to me, how do you engage with them? I said, well, it's a bit hard to chat when they leave when I get there. Like, it would be nice to stay and talk about the issues, but that's fine. And it doesn't happen everywhere and it's not big numbers. Anyway, this one particular small regional school, some teachers were out the front as I walked in, and, that's fine. It's part of my job. You deal with it. Anyway, later that day I caught up with a journalist at their very small local paper, and her husband, who is of a profession that you would want to keep in a regional community, had said, that they were thinking about having a family, but they didn't know if they were going to stay, because she said, I'm really worried about schools. I'm a big believer in public education, but, things are so bad and the vacancies are so bad at our local school that the teachers are walking out. And I said to her, there's not a single vacancy at that school, because there's not. So they'd walked out as part of a bigger movement. And again, fine, people are allowed to do what they like in terms of being members of unions, and I don't have an objection to that. But this was a young professional woman who was literally saying, I don't know if we'll stay in this town because our school is so bad that the teachers are walking out because the vacancies are so high. They have no vacancies. They are fully staffed. So we had this conversation. She said, I'm going to go home and tell my husband that maybe we can stay. I said, yes, you can stay. I mean, I live in the country. I'm like, don't leave. But that it's a small example, but that's what worries me. And and at that particular school, I think there were about 20 people out the front. The principal said 2 of them were their members of staff. They didn't know who the other people were. So it's the perception of that I think is concerning, because, I don't know how many other people are thinking, well, I can't stay in a regional community, or I can't do this because my child will not get a good education, when it's actually not the truth. And so that's what I get a bit frustrated about when that happens. Anyway.
So when there's other people that follow you will be aware that you have you have conflicted with the Teachers Federation on a few occasions. You labelled them late last year as a obstructionist protection racket.
Yeah, I did.
What's your message to teachers that maybe you can cut through and maybe go around some of the union messaging that is unhelpful?
I mean, look, despite appearances, I do meet regularly with the union. My office speaks regularly with them as well. I chat to Angelo. There are things that we do want to find a way forward, because like any minister in government, you do need to find a way to try to work with the union. I don't like industrial action. I don't like it when people can't send their children to school because this is happening. I don't like it as a parent, although my 9-year-old goes because she wants to support mum, which is lovely. But anyway, that's her choice. However, you do want to have a constructive relationship, because like I said at the beginning, it disrupts kids, and I don't want that. And if there are things that we can do to land some kind of outcome, of course that's what we want to be able to do. But I also think that what I get, as I said, concerned about is sometimes I do think the union do a disservice to the teaching workforce when they're putting out messaging out there that's not really, true in terms of what I see when I'm in classrooms. And so the biggest thing that I hear is not so much, to be honest, it's not so much pay, it's workload and what we can do in that space. So that's why my focus has been on what are the things that we can do that make that practical example or difference day in, day out, that teachers will go, oh, great, that's something that I don't need to do. We've got a 20% target, which we're on track to meet in terms of those low-value admin tasks. Things like those curriculum resources will help. NESA, I think, need to do more with their accreditation process, because, again, that takes a lot of time. So that, to me, is where I can see some more constructive reform in terms of looking at workload, because to simplify it down just to pay, I actually think is not an accurate reflection of some of the challenges. And the reason that I say that is, at the moment, we've got pretty generous incentives for regional communities, and, I'm an MP from the region, so it's pretty front and centre for me. You can literally get $30,000 or $40,000 a year more to go and work in some of those schools. They're our hardest to staff. So if it was just about pay, I would have a list as long as my arm of people wanting to teach west of the divide. That's not what happens. So to simplify it just in terms of pay people more and they will stay or you will get more, I think doesn't give due credit to the complexities and the nuances of what we need to do. And like I said, my frustration comes sometimes too with every single new idea that we have on the table, different things that we want to try. It's always about why it won't work rather than, well, why can't we actually look constructively and see whether this will make a difference for teachers in the classroom and students. It would be really nice to hear unions talking about students, because that doesn't happen often enough either, in my view. So
you mentioned it's not all about pay, but for some campaigns it is largely about pay. In recent weeks, in Western Australia and Queensland have increased their offers to teachers and public servants.
Yeah.
Is the government committed to its wage cap?
Yeah, we are. And, I think for us as a government, we've been very clear on that wages policy across the public service. We've had 2.5% for many, many years. And obviously now what we have on the table, for our teachers in the next 2 years is effectively 6.5% over the next 2 years, which can also be changed if they offer offsets or ways that we can look at productivity measures, which also hasn't happened at this point in time. But they have been consistent positions for us as a government. And I do think it's the right call to make, because at the end of the day, we're responsible for everyone who lives and works in New South Wales. Yes, we've got to have a public service that's remunerated well. We are offering pay rises year on year on year, but we also have to look at how else we allocate budget spending. And I think for me as Minister, if I know over the next 2 years, what our staffing costs are going to be. It means I know how else we can allocate the rest of the budget. And if you move back into that system that we've had previously, where everything's negotiated and the awards can change, you don't get that consistency in terms of knowing where else you can allocate your funding. And I think that's really important, because I know what our expenses will be when it comes to staffing. So then I can look at the allocations we get from Treasury and go, okay, we can run this program, we can do that helps, in terms of teacher workforce and retention. We can do these amazing things with curriculum. We can build the schools that we need. There's not an endless bucket of taxpayer money that you have to spend. You've got to make sensible decisions and be upfront about that. And I do think for us as a coalition government, we've always done that. It's a core part of our economic policy to say, these are our wages policy, this is what we're going to be doing, and it means then that we can make those other financial decisions around that benefit everybody who lives in the state, not just the public service. And it's about getting that balance right, and that's what I think we've done with the policy.
We'll come to questions from the floor in just a moment. But before we do, on workload, you've highlighted that there are time savings that can be achieved through centralising resources, providing easy access to trusted, high-quality resources. That's something that clearly we already know is something that can work, particularly in reducing variability and in supporting early teachers, especially rather than reinventing the wheel. I suspect it will also be opposed by some that will say that this is an encroachment on teachers' own creativity, autonomy and ability to craft their own lessons. How do you respond to that?
Well, they don't have to use the resources if they don't want to. I mean, it's not mandatory. The idea behind it is that it will give people a framework and kind of give them the basic ingredients that they need for the recipe for the lesson that they're going to conduct. And I think there will be teachers who will jump on it and welcome it with open arms. There will be others who potentially, have their systems in place, as you say, maybe those who have been in the profession a bit longer that are quite happy to use the resources that they've got. So I think the idea is about making it available. But certainly in conversations that I've had with teachers, and we often will pull together roundtables, the Premier and I met earlier this year with teachers from across the sectors and talked about what are some of the things that we could do. And the two standouts were more admin support, more hands, more people to help us do our day-to-day job, and also better access to curriculum resources. And so I think what we'll find is that there is a good take-up. If people, for whatever reason, feel that, that they're happy and that's not a key concern for them, like I said, they don't have to access it. But I think that the research would show that most people will, because why wouldn't you when it's there for you to help you do your job? Yeah.
And with that, we're over to the floor. So if you'd raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you. Susie Riddell, CEO of Social Ventures Australia. Thank you very much, Minister. When you talked about evidence-based policy, that was music to my ears. We need more of that everywhere. I'm curious about what your expectations or perhaps aspirations are for the Australian Education Research Organisation, AERO, and what you're hoping to see them deliver in terms of supporting you and the other states and territories in their evidence-based policy, including in early childhood, not just education. And if you know where the biggest gaps in our evidence base are that you're hoping that AERO and others are going to be able to fill to inform our policy going forward.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think that the establishment of AERO is really exciting. I think for us in New South Wales, we've been a bit spoiled having CESE for quite a while, who do really great work in that space. But to start to have a national conversation around some of these issues and really look at evidence base across the country rather than just in individual jurisdictions, I think is exciting. I think I'm just trying to be polite in how I phrase this. It was a little slow to get going, often when you bring everybody together, sometimes things take a little while, even though there was very much goodwill behind all the ministers at the table to get it up and running. Look, I think for me, some of the key areas where I see opportunities for AERO to look at obviously include things in the early childhood space at the moment. I think that that's a key area. Victoria are looking at what they need to be doing and, we're working very much in conjunction with them in terms of that universal pre-K rollout. I think that transition to school component, I think looking at different ways that we can work in that space and share knowledge, because, early childhood is such a complex policy area, and anybody who thinks that it's, Play-Doh and finger painting is so far from the reality of what happens every day in those services. And so I think that's probably an area that we could do some serious work in. That would be something that would be on my agenda. I guess the other thing too is when we look at the different, and bear with me a bit, but we're about to negotiate the next sort of school funding reform agreement, and there's obviously areas of priority as part of that. I think that where ministers land, and I don't want to preempt where we might land on some of those initiatives, that then has to be backed in by work that I think Aero can do. And so I see there being quite a good relationship between the funding school reform agreements, the work that Aero does, and making sure that there's a synergy between what the evidence base is telling us we need to focus on and what those principles are in those agreements. And I don't want to preempt that, but I've got a few ideas about what I think we could be doing in that space. So, yeah.
Well, we're on early education. Please.
Minister, Chang Lim from the Australian Childcare Alliance, New South Wales. When we first met 5+ years ago, you were Minister as Early Childhood Education. My first question to you is why does New South Wales have got up to 4 degree qualified early childhood education teachers compared to every other state, which is about 1.6. Well, it was 1.2 at the time. Now it's 1.6. Ironically, 10 years on, the National Quality Framework has been in existence. And the quality rating system itself shows that under Quality Area 1, for example, all other states beat New South Wales in terms of education outcomes and programming. So why do we continue with up to 4 ECTs that we can't find now? And yet we struggle. And the white paper from the National Productivity Commission, New South Wales Productivity Commissioner, also asked the same question: why are we higher than the New South Wales, than the national standards, when we cannot produce the evidence that requires to show that we are better?
Thanks, Chang. And that's obviously something that, you and I have spoken about a few times over the years that I've had this portfolio. I mean, I think for me, particularly when I first became minister, that was something that was in place already in terms of wanting to have really high standards in New South Wales. And I guess as a simple instinctive position for me, wanting to have higher quality in our state and be aspirational is not necessarily a bad thing. And I can see the reasons why we wanted to do that. But I also accept your point in terms of, well, what does that evidence show, whether there's been improved outcomes, the workforce challenges and the pressures. And again, remiss of me probably not to talk about what we see in the early childhood space as well, because you're right, it's really hard at the moment to get the educators that people need. And that qualification piece is a challenge in terms of the waivers that are being offered and how we need to manage that, particularly in certain areas. And again, regional communities are often the ones where we struggle. Ironically, there people will leave who are early childhood teacher trained, will most likely leave early childhood services to go and work in teaching and work in schools because it pays better and there's better conditions. So depending on who you talk to, there's differing views about the attractiveness of teacher pay. But I do think as we move towards, as I said, that universal pre-K, rolling out more childcare places, looking at our staffing requirements and how that works, and if it is still reflective of what we need, is something that is on the agenda. I'm not, and I can't sort of foreshadow here at a meeting like this what we will do, but it is something that we need to be looking at. And I know that it's something that we're in conversations with our early childhood policy advisory group about. What can we do in this space? Is the current system working? Are there things that we need to look at doing to improve, attract and retain, and make sure we've got the workforce that we need? And obviously, the ACA are a valuable part of that group. And I think there's an opportunity for discussion in this space.
Please.
Oh, hi, Jeffrey Wang here. I'm probably, as my capacity as a concerned parent, there's been some media reports recently around the changes to selective schools criteria, where there's some lowering of standards. So obviously that's drawn a particular concern in a segment of the community. But it doesn't lowering the criteria to selective schools kind of defeat the purpose of selective schools in the first place?
Thank you for the question. So, there has been a bit of interest in that announcement that we made a few weeks ago. It builds on some work that actually Rob Stokes started when he was the minister around selective school placements, and we had some work done for us in terms of what is working well in that system, what are some of the changes that we need to make. And so a few things have been brought in over the last couple of years. First and foremost, some changes to the test itself to make it less easily coachable, for lack of a better term. We wanted to make sure that we were finding children who had that ability to be able to go into a selective stream. We also made some changes in terms of the test itself. There was a bit of a focus, not a focus, but it was a bit weighted more towards some of the maths components, which again, the stats were showing us that we ended up sort of having more boys than girls come in. And so there's been different tweaks and work done in that space over the last couple of years. And then the last piece that was suggested as a policy change was, as you say, to look at having a cohort of students who are from either Aboriginal background, students with disability, students from lower socioeconomic background, and also rural and regional, and giving them opportunities to come into selective schools. Now, in terms of the standards question, these students will still have to hit a high benchmark to be able to come to a selective school. So there will be an opportunity for some of them to be considered, yes, at a slightly lower mark than some of their counterparts. But the idea behind that is actually, I think, a sound policy one, because it's about trying to give those students an opportunity. It's 20% of the cohort that we would like to have in place for children from those backgrounds. If we don't get enough applications, if we don't get students within those cohorts hitting that benchmark, then those places will go back to the general testing community. But it's actually about trying to recognise the ability for those kids to get an opportunity to make sure that our selective schools are a good reflection of public education and of our communities. So that is the intention with that policy. It'll start to come into place from next year. But like we've seen with selective schools and that process, it doesn't mean that there won't be opportunities to look at how well it's working. We'll look at the numbers, we'll look at how many come in, we'll look at the marks that those children get and make sure that system is working as it should. I do think that it is the right decision, and like I said, it comes off the back of work that was done in 2018 that was really about trying to make selective schools more of an opportunity for more kids, particularly those who, statistics would tell you are generally less likely to be able to get that opportunity, but who actually have the academic ability to perform and to perform really well in that school context.
Janet Freeman, board member for Armidale Catholic Schools. You haven't really gone far in talking about rural and remote. I applaud all of the things about teacher assistants and workforce, etc. But do we run the risk of those things only being available at scale? So your Mungandais and your Gunnedah, you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Do we run the risk of exacerbating the rural-urban divide?
No, because for me, I live in the country. My kids go to our local public schools, born and raised in Gunnedah, and very proudly so. And I think that perspective that I bring as an education minister who understands some of the challenges in rural and regional communities more so than anyone else in some respects, because I live it every day as well. So I think for me, it's about making sure that the policies that we have in place have that opportunity to work in both city and metro areas, but they won't necessarily be the same. And I'll give you an example with that. So with the way that we want to roll out those admin supports, we're going to do a trial in Sydney area, but we're also going to do trial in rural and regional areas, because what we might find, say, for instance, up in our part of the world, we might have those staff based in say, a Moree, but they might go out and do some time at Mungandai, and then they might go out to Warialda, and they might go, like we do our hub and spoke for our casual supplementation model at the moment as well. You have a core school, but then you're able to go out and feed in and tap in that support to those smaller school communities so they don't miss out. So definitely in terms of the policy thinking about what we're putting in place, we understand, or I certainly understand, that there can be a real fundamental difference between how something will work in a metro area versus how something works in a rural and remote area. And, even with our mid-career transition program that we've got with the first 30 odd, about half of them are out in regional communities as well. There's other initiatives that we want to do around our teaching workforce, and one that was in the school, or the teacher supply strategy, was a grow your own initiative, and it's very much focused on rural and regional communities. So it's about looking at upskilling existing SLSOs and giving them support and funding to get through a university degree, and also looking at identifying high-performing high school students who live in regional communities, giving them work in a school and giving them financial support and supporting them and mentoring them through their teaching degree, because I know that I don't have to convince someone who lives in Gunnedah to move to Gunnedah, but I could help retrain them to become a teacher. And I think that's how we've got to look at it. And that's part of the initiatives. And there's a definite rural and regional slant on that, because we've got to look at things a bit differently in our country communities just because of the very nature of how things are. Yeah.
We're almost out of time. I'll invite one more question from the floor. But before we do, somebody in this room, who I won't name, is responsible for a splash in the papers today suggesting that that at the top end of teaching that there's a need to increase pay of up to 40% to attract more high performers and to reward high performers, and also to look to attract more people from industry.
Yep.
You've also set a target to increase the number of highly accomplished and lead teachers by tenfold, which is a very ambitious goal. How will the state get there, and what should we expect to see as a result?
Yeah, it was a bit like copying my homework this morning, looking at the Oz this morning. You know, there's a few things in there that are similar, but it's actually great to see because it means that we're all thinking in the same way because they're the actual policy reforms that we need to put in place. And, you know, looking at those mid-career options and, again, looking at how you effectively reward excellence in the profession is what I read, you know, that target around 40% and using your HALT accreditations to do that. I mean, you know, we've been pretty clear as a government, and I know that the Premier made some comments recently about it, is that we do want to have a look at what we can do to reward excellence in the profession. And again, it's about modernising the profession. It's about making sure that we can recognise talent, not just tenure. And I think some of our pay scales are quite antiquated in the way that they've been set up and not like how other professions are. And, you know, I mean, that did get turned into a bit of conversation about performance pay, which was not the intention. It was actually about saying, well, how do we attract and reward those who we all know perform well? And I think the HALT system is part of that. I think the work that we have done to really look at how that process is carried out will help. Breaking it into modules, giving people an opportunity to get feedback midway through rather than having to go through the whole thing and working out whether or not you've been successful. You know, we had an event recently with the last group that had received those accreditations, and they were talking to me about the change that process has undergone and the difference that it will make. And again, once you put more through the system, they can then mentor others who are coming in through the system as well. So it's an ambitious target, but again, aim for nothing, hit nothing. Let's go big and go bold. If people want to really show their teaching excellence and can do that through that HALT system, get the pay that reflects that. And then separately to that, as I said, as a government, we're absolutely looking at ways that we can recognise excellence, the ways that we can not feel like we're in a position now where our best teachers have to get promoted out of the classroom if they want pay rises. And I think we can and should be bold and innovative with how we look at that, and that's certainly something that the Premier and I are working on, and look forward to sharing more about what that might look like very soon.
Good morning, Minister. Thank you for the insights you've provided this morning. I love Mark Scott's commentary coming through as well. Andy Cox here. We work in the education technology space. We support schools with the implementation and integration of educational technology across all sectors and all stages. How would you challenge us to respond to some of the challenges that you've raised this morning, and what role do you think technology plays in this space?
So I actually think where there might be a bit of an untapped resource in the tech space is how we provide support to our staff in terms of their career progression. And the reason I say that is because at the moment we've been rolling out in New South Wales what we call our RAG, terrible acronym, but anyway, it stands for Rural Access Gap. And effectively what we've done in about 1,000 rural and regional schools, we've done a complete overhaul. Everyone has a smart board. All the teachers have their own laptops. They've all got programs that actually talk to each other and that they can plan and work remotely, which is, you know, really exciting and probably should have happened a long time ago. But it's opened up a lot of educational opportunities for the kids as well. So, you know, I've been at schools in very remote parts of the state where they're beaming into courses down at the Opera House and things that they just wouldn't be able to do. So I think that technology change for students has been really great. We've got, you know, amazing programs where students can be doing virtual reality and green screens, and they all love it and they pick it up in 5 minutes and you think they've had it for 10 years, but that's kids and technology. So I think that space is progressing really well. Where I think there's an opportunity is to look at how we can get better collaboration between teachers and better professional support networks happening using technology. And this was something that we did a bit during COVID. We set up what we called effectively virtual staff rooms, and it gave people an opportunity to share resources and to work together. But I see that as being something that we can do probably on a smaller scale. And to go back to the question about rural and regional, that there's one program that we have that we're piloting at the moment, which is effectively a group of very small schools that are working together. I was at one of the schools just outside of Bathurst a couple of weeks ago. There's only one PE teacher there. It's a central school. So she was a beginning teacher, and she said, I would not have come here but I knew that the school was a part of this program. So what they do once a week, and there's about 6 subjects that they're in, and it's focusing on year 11 and 12, is that they all come online and they team teach and they share resources. And she marks her students' assessments, but she also has a neighbouring teacher who's actually at a school at Collarenebri, which is not really that close to Bathurst. But they work collaboratively together. So she says with her students, she's really confident, for instance, of her highest performing student in her class, giving them the mark that would equate to a band 6, because she's been able to road test it with a colleague who is several hundred kilometres away, but technology has let them do that. Another school that's part of that program is Narrabri. Now, Narrabri, which is heart of agricultural country in this state, could not get an ag teacher for love or money, extra pay, everything was being offered. They've now got a position, and what made that teacher come was being a part of this program, because there was professional support and development literally available at the touch of a button. I think that's an area where there's more that we can be doing, and a part of it is about taking the profession with us. But if you know that you can go and teach in a regional school, particularly in a high school area where you would worry about professional opportunities, that subject discipline, double checking, having a head teacher who doesn't fit in your KLA, like all of that is a concern, I think, particularly for beginning teachers. So I see that as an opportunity to really expand and opportunities there that maybe we haven't tapped into fully yet. So,
Minister, what's your vision for improving education in New South Wales?
Right.
How are you going to deliver a high-performing modern workforce that you've alluded to? What are the pillars?
So
of
we're
that?
finishing with an easy question, so I'll just be able to get that one through. Sure. Look, I mean, to be honest, it's probably a collective of all of the things that I've talked about this morning. It's really high-quality early childhood education and getting things right, literally from birth to 5, and making sure that that's across agencies and that government departments work together. It's having great transitions from school into high school into the workforce. It's about having happy teachers who are supported and feel rewarded in their profession, and I think that's important as well. And like I said at the very beginning, it's actually about making sure that students are the first and last thing we think about with every policy decision that we make. So there you go. That's a quick appraisal for you.
Minister Mitchell, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.